Matthew 13:15 through 17. For the hearts of the people have grown dull, their ears are hard of hearing, and their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears, lest they should understand with their hearts and turn, so that I should heal them. But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. For assuredly I say to you, that many prophets and righteous men desire to see what you see, and did not see it, to hear what you hear, and did not hear it.
This morning, we continue our discussion on 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Now, we looked at kind of just mainly the text last week and kind of broke it down. We found the sections, saw some important parts of it, how it was broken out, the different arguments, and just as a quick review to get ourselves into that before we start looking at these other questions, we found some common objections to a covering, and that's the cultural argument. Oh, it's something just there for the Corinthians. That's all it really was. The idea of praying and prophesying, social norms, so it's not binding today, and then we saw the long hair argument. Now, last week, remember I said we had a chiasm here, and I didn't have the PowerPoint to be able to show that, so I wanted to put that up here today for you. Verse 2, I praise you for remembering me in everything and for holding the traditions as I pass them on to you. And then he talks about the headship. The second section, every man who prays or prophesies with his head uncovered dishonors his head. Every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is the same as having her head shaved. For if a woman does not cover her head, she might as well have her hair cut off. But it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved. Then she should cover her head. A man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. Then the third section, for man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. And then verse 10 is kind of the central part of this. For this reason, it is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority on her head because of the angels. And then we back out. Again, we have this idea of woman for the man, man from the woman, etc. And then we back out again. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for her to pray with her head uncovered? Does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it's a disgrace to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory. Her long hair is given to her as a covering. And then we come back out again for the traditions. If anyone is contentious about this, we have no such customs, nor do the churches of God. The arguments for the covering, we saw the Christological argument, the headship idea, Christ is over man, man is over woman, the dishonor. The man plus a covering is dishonor, but the woman with no covering is dishonor. No covering for a woman, it's equal to her having a shaved head, one and the same, according to the Apostle Paul. We have the creation and angelic arguments, the natural orders of things. Women created for man, not the other way around. The power on her head, some translations will say power, some translations will say symbol or a sign. In the original, it really is, she's got to have the power on her head. The authority on her head. And it is kind of implied in that this is a symbol of power. Kind of like what we might have a diadem or a crown or something. So there's something on her head that represents power and authority. Again, there's a sign there. What is the sign? It's the authority of a man. And then we saw the idea of the angels, and it's kind of vague as to what that is. How it's kind of hard. I was discussing this with somebody last night, and he said something that was probably the best explanation of this that I had ever heard of. The idea of Satan and his angels having fallen from heaven because they could not keep their proper place that they were created to have. And so because of the angels, in a sense, as an example, using the angels as an example, they fell from the properly created order of things. The women ought to have a sign of authority on their head so that they do not fall from the proper order of things. I don't know. It was kind of a probably about the best explanation I've read out of anything. Again, I still am not sure exactly what it means. There's really not much there. And then the sociological argument, what is proper? It should be kind of obvious here. He asks them to think about it. What do you really think is possible, is proper? Should she be uncovered? Then the long hair argument. Her long hair is given for her glory or for covering. Is Paul saying that even nature is showing she needs a covering here? Since she has one type of covering already, that she should have another in worship? The long hair argument. And then the ecclesiastical argument here is 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 16, but if any man seem to be contentious, we have no such custom, neither do the churches of God. What is Paul saying here? Is he saying, well, if anybody really wants to argue about this, we can just throw it out. After making all of these arguments for the necessity of it, then he says, oh, it's really not that necessary. That doesn't really make sense. Another way is you Corinthians are the only ones who have messed this up. But he does praise them at the beginning. You are keeping the traditions. You are doing these things. But make sure that you're continuing in this. And if anyone has anything else, we don't have such customs. Let him know that we do not have his customs in the church. So we said today that we would discuss some questions that arise over the text. I had a couple here, and I had one that I had planned to have on this list, and it was perhaps the only question that somebody brought up to me. So, first off is wife or woman in verse 3, 5, 6, 10, and 13. Remember we read from the English Standard Version last week, and it said wife in those instances instead of woman, as all the rest of the translations would read. So what do we find there? The second one is the long hair. Is that the covering, or do we need a covering in addition to the long hair? If we need a covering, what covering is necessary? What constitutes a covering? The next one is, does this apply to Christians only or all females in the assembly? And the other is it only in the assembly? Does a woman need to wear a covering whenever she prays or prophesies? Let's start here. I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. But every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it is a disgrace for a wife to cut her hair or to shave her head, let her cover her head. Verse 10, that is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Verse 13, judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? That's the English Standard reading of this passage. Why did the English Standard translating team, the translator team, choose to depart from the traditional translation? Aner is the word for man or husband. It can be either one. Gune is the word for wife or woman. It can be either one. Context alone determines which translation to take. Why did the English Standard Version translator team choose to depart from our traditional translation of woman rather than wife? This is what we said here. This term may refer to a woman or a wife, depending on the context. In the footnotes of the English Standard Version, they explain themselves. And they say, in verses 5 through 13, the Greek word gune is translated wife in verses that deal with wearing a veil, a sign of being married in first century culture. They went with the cultural argument. You wear a veil because you're married. And that's the reason why you have one on in the worship service. It goes back to that cultural argument. Well, this is just what's going on around the time. Well, how do we know here that this is what everyone in Corinth did. As Corinth is a melting pot of all different cultures. How do we know? This is one of the few instances where I'm not happy with the English Standard Version. Y'all know I use it primarily. That's my favorite text because when I was a Greek student at Faulkner, I could put my Greek New Testament beside it and the English Standard Version, and I could flip-flop back and forth extremely easily. It's a very transparent, very literal translation. But it was translated by a group of men. Let's not forget that. And so we do have to use common sense here, and thankfully they do explain themselves here so we can make a decision. They went with the cultural argument on that. Notice here, the head of every wife is her husband. Then every wife who prays or prophesies, for if a wife will not cover her head, it is disgraceful for a wife. But woman is the glory of God. For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. That is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent. You see how they kind of flip-flop back and forth, and they only use it there in the reference to the covering. But something interesting I saw about this here is, what about the men? Can we say that, well, if it's a married man, then he should not wear a covering. But if he is an unmarried man, he can pray or prophesy with his head uncovered. If she is an unmarried female, she can pray or prophesy with her head uncovered. The context doesn't lend to that. The context doesn't give us anything like that. It seems to be straightforward one way or the other. So we have to go with the traditional reading of woman in this case, just depending on the context of the scriptures. We're not interested in first century culture. We're interested in God's will for us as Christians today. And an example was given to me last night of a congregation that they don't really teach this. Any new Christian that comes in, the passage is given to them with no explanation whatsoever. Read this passage. And with very few exceptions, the women come out of reading that passage with the understanding of having to wear a veil. With no other explanation, no cultural explanation, just taking the text for themselves. That's interesting. That if we just take the text alone and we forget everything else, what does the passage say to us? Long hair as a covering, or do we need a covering in addition to our long hair? Now last week we talked about long hair versus short hair, and really is that an argument? And it's not the argument in this passage. You know, the question arises all the time. How long is too long for a man? Is a man's hair too long? And we talked about we don't want to blur the distinctions there. We want to keep ourselves masculine. We want to keep ourselves feminine. We start crossing those lines, we start having problems. The point is not the length. The point is the heart. The point is the image. So, what does the text here say about a covering, though? Let's look at this here. Judge for yourselves. This is starting in verse 13. Is it proper for a wife to pray to God, or a woman to pray with God with her head uncovered? Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him, but if a woman has long hair, it is for her glory, for her hair is given to her for a covering. Judge within yourselves. Does it make sense to make all of these arguments and then say this? Oh, well, by the way, the covering is your hair. You got to have all of this here because the covering is your hair. How can she be uncovered if she has long hair? If the hair is the covering, how can we consider her to be uncovered if she hasn't cut her hair? If a woman has long hair, and she's in the assembly and she prays and prophesies, how could she be uncovered if her long hair is her covering? That doesn't make any sense. Uncovered equals dishonor. To shave it short, he talks about shaving it short or cutting it. She's assumed in the passage that she has long hair. She's assumed in the passage to have that length of hair that is considered to be a natural covering, but there's something else involved in it. If she will not cover, then she should shave it short. If she won't cover, but she's already covered. So why should she shave it? See what I'm saying here? There's got to be something in addition to this. It can't be the long hair. Since it's a shame, let her be covered. Since it's a shame to cut her hair short, then let her leave her hair long. Again, we've got to look at the context of the passage and again follow that out there. He's saying here, judge within yourself. Is it proper for this to happen? Is it proper for her to pray or prophesy with her head uncovered? Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not nature itself teach you that she should have a covering? Is this passage the actual command? Or is he using nature as an example for what he's trying to teach them? Is this passage the command? Saying, is this passage the end of it? Like, by the way, your long hair is your covering. Or is he saying, nature even teaches us that there must be a covering? This is an example. This is not the command. This is not the answer to it. He's using this as an example to prove what he's trying to teach them. He says, judge within yourselves. Looking at nature, do you really think you shouldn't wear a covering? By looking at how God has designed us and the nature of things, do you really think that you should be without this? Nature doesn't teach us that. Nature even shows you that you should be covered. So long hair, or a covering in addition to, long hair isn't the command. Long hair is just the example of the necessity. You can't have long hair and be uncovered if long hair is the covering. So that leaves us with the answer in that it must be in addition to the long hair. Question number 3. If that's the case, what covering is necessary? What should we have on our head? What is it? What command do we have here? The only command about this, the only instruction about this is verse 10. That is why a wife or a woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. That's the only thing that said any form of instruction is that it must be a symbol of authority. I want us to use an example here. Well, first let's look at this definition. A symbol, that is to say, the veil by which women at prayer, when they draw near to the heavenly realm, protect themselves from the amorous glances of certain angels. Remember, we said there was that idea that there was the evil angels that were present, and the women needed to keep themselves modest in the presence of angels. But the veil may also have been simply a symbol of womanly dignity, especially befitting a Christian woman, and especially in the presence of holy angels. This comes from the Greek-English lexicon of the New Testament, Bowert, Art, and Greenbridge. Sometimes the newer versions would have Danker in there. It's a very, very highly respected Greek-English lexicon. This is what everyone goes to for this is the authority, is what I'm trying to say, on New Testament Greek language. So they say the veil may also have been simply a symbol of womanly dignity, befitting a Christian woman. Kind of gives us a solid explanation here. She ought to have the symbol of authority. She ought to have the power on her head. This is a sign. I am wearing this covering to show my submission to my head. I am wearing this covering to show my submission to my head. If, therefore, the whole church comes together and all speak in tongues and outsiders or unbelievers enter, will not they say that you are out of your minds? 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and verse 23. Things are done a certain way in our worship services so that we can provide good examples. People look at the way we do things and understand by our examples what exactly we are doing. I think that principle applies over here. Paul makes a case for the proper order of things in worship because of how people outside may view us when they come in. So let's use this principle here. And here's where I said we're going to take an example from this congregation. If y'all remember Sister Pauline Keith, used to sit here. Sister Francine Thornton, who used to sit in the back, where Brother Greg Griffin's sitting right now. They wore what was essentially little doilies on their head. It wasn't long. It was just a small round covering on the top of their head. Can anyone truly question, besides being sarcastic about it, can we truly question what that symbolized? If we walk into an assembly of people and every woman is uncovered but one, what do we instantly know about that woman? She believes in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. We know immediately what that sign or that symbol is. We immediately know what that is. Other women here wear longer veils that cover the back of the hair, sometimes fall down on the shoulders. Again, the same thing though. Does that mean anything different than what our previous example wore? Notice we don't have anything in that text about the size of it, or it is a sign of authority. Right? Again, does that mean anything different? We can say confidently here, the key word is a symbol of authority. A covering on the head. Number 4, does this apply to Christians only? Now, this was actually asked by one of our younger people. This is the question that I already had in here, and I definitely wanted to keep it because it was asked. And this one's not going to take us very long to get through here. Are non-Christians praying and prophesying in assemblies when we're gathered together and such? Are non-Christians praying and prophesying? No. 1 Corinthians is written to whom? Christians, members of the church. He's talking to a congregation whose head is Christ. The non-Christian, they don't have Christ their head, man over woman in the church. Ultimately, yes, Christ is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. But we're talking about a congregation whose head is Christ. Are non-Christians worried about whether or not they should cover themselves? We've got a lot of steps before that point, before we get to a covering, right? We've got to get them into the blood of Christ before we're even worried about whether or not they have their head covered or not. Number 5, does this apply to the assembly only? There's a lot of good arguments on either side of this. Is it any time we pray or prophesy? Is it only in the assembly? I want us to look at the context of the passage this morning, and we can make our determination from there. The biggest question, when does it apply? And of course, context is our friend. Verse 2 and verse 18 are very similar, but they're opposites. They show a contrast in things. Let me come back to this here. Verse 2 says, "Now I praise you because you keep the traditions that are delivered." Now, in verse 18, he says, "Now in the following, I cannot praise you. These two things are tied together in the writer's mind. These two things are happening in the same general context in the writer's mind. In this I praise you, now in this I cannot praise you. And then he goes straight off of those two things, and he goes right into other aspects of the worship service. Remember, 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1 is really it's the continuation of chapter 10. Verse 1 really fits with chapter 10. Be imitators of me as I am imitators of Christ. Now, I praise you because you keep the traditions that have been delivered to you. And he goes on to talk about the head covering. And then in verse 18 he says, but in the following I cannot praise you. Because when you come together, you do these things. Those two things are tied very closely in the apostle's mind as he's writing these things. But aren't praying and prophesying happening outside the worship service? I certainly hope they're happening outside the worship service. In both cases, whether the man or the woman. Can a Christian woman prophesy in the worship services? Something else we got to consider with this here. The context of the passage lends towards it being included with the rest of chapter 11 and in chapters 12, 13, and 14 as well. If we look at the whole rest of the book of Corinthians, remember, we're not just talking about one little section here. We are looking at a passage that is taken out of a larger context, a letter that is written to Christians. We look in chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 3, and we're kind of talking about divisions and who really is head. Who's really king here? And we start, then chapter 4 is kind of floating into chapter 5, and in chapter 5, he talks about you've got to put this individual away. Chapter 6, he talks about the sexual immorality and going before the courts. That's obviously not a part of the worship service. The divisions, yeah, that could be technically part of the worship service, but really more we see this just as a congregation in general and working together in this. Then we get into chapter 7, chapter 8, and chapter 9. Chapter 7 talks about whether or not a man should take a wife. Then we come down into chapter 11, and he makes a definite break in the narrative. And he shifts on to something completely different. And then in verse 18, in contrast to this, you're doing this. And it's included into the worship service there. So it does seem that these are tied very closely together with the context. Is the covering necessary? What do we make out of all of this? I've got a glare on my clock there. I can't quite see where I'm at. What do we make out of all of this? Do we need a covering? Is long hair sufficient? On the flip side, if a man's hair is too long, is he now covered, being in the worship service? Has God demonstrated a need for such through his natural order? Is there an example of that we need a covering? And then when do we need to wear it? And I understand that this has been very brief. I understand that we've only just touched the tip of the iceberg here with some of these things, and there's still a lot of questions that arise with this. But what we've seen through here is an interesting thought about this. Baptism and the covering are two highly contested topics in Christendom today. Now, you can get people really upset when talking about the covering, and you can get people really upset when talking about baptism, right? But both of these commands require very little physical effort on our part. Now, I understand there's a lot of mental effort that goes into both of these commands. Baptism, we're making a complete, utter change in our life. It is the biggest decision that we will ever make in our life. And in today's culture especially, I understand how it could be extremely hard for a woman to put this sign on her head and invite that onto them. I understand how that could be. So that's why I say up here, it requires very little physical effort on our part to obey these commands. There's a lot that goes into them. I'm not downplaying them by any means. But both of them all come down to humility and submission to God's will and simply understanding the text. As we said, if we look at this passage, we read the book of 1 Corinthians and we look at this here and we just read it with taking everything else out of the way, what are we to determine about the passage? If we put everything else to the side and just read what God has said, what do we determine about it? It comes down to humility and submission to God's will. Who is our head? Look at Ephesians chapter 5 real quick with me. For the husband is head of the wife, even as Christ is head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Husbands, love your wives, as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. Who's our head today? You know, this passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 is all about headship, right? The Christological argument. We have Christ as the head of man. Man is the head of woman. That's the natural order of things that God has created. Who is our head as people in the church today? I thought I had one other point on there, but is our head Christ? Have we submitted ourselves to him as a woman would submit herself to her husband? Christ gave himself up for the church, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word. Have we been cleansed by the washing of water with the word? Having heard the word, believed it, repented of our sins, and confessed that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, have we been buried with him in baptism to have our sins washed away? Are we presented to him holy, without spot or wrinkle, or any such thing, that we would be before him holy and without blemish? What is our spiritual condition today? Do we need to be baptized for the remission of our sins? And so this morning, there's no better time to do so. If we've been baptized, but we've fallen away, and we haven't been obeying the commands, we haven't been staying true to the path, then this morning we can make it right as we come, stand, and sing.